For decades, the paper box murder has been this huge debate in Hong Kong. So many people believe the convicted killer, Oh Young Ping Kyung, was framed. They point to all these supposed holes in the case. But you know what? We're not here to try and solve the crime all over again. Nope. Today we're doing something different. We're going to get into the anatomy of the conviction itself. We're going to break down the exact legal logic, that chain of evidence that convinced not one, but two separate juries to come to the very same conclusion.
So this is the big question, right? How on earth do you convict a killer when you've got no witnesses, no confession, and not even a clear motive? This was the massive puzzle the prosecution was staring at. I mean, with zero direct evidence, their only shot was to build this airtight case. An argument so logical, woven together from all these tiny, indirect clues that a jury would have no choice but to say guilty. And that's what this whole explainer is about. We're going to see exactly how they pulled it off.
And believe me, the legal journey here was a real roller coaster. So, you see, the body was found in late '74. They get a conviction about a year later, but then an appeal court steps in and says, hold on a second. They found some issues with how the case was presented, and boom, ordered a complete do-over, a retrial. But here's the kicker. In May 1976, a brand new jury hears a much tighter, more refined version of the case, and they come back with the exact same verdict: guilty.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll talk about what it means to build a case without any witnesses. Then, we'll get into the prosecution's core logical chain. We'll see how they forged that crucial first link, and then the final links that sealed the deal. And finally, we'll look at the logic of the conviction itself. Let's get into it.
Okay, first up, a verdict without witnesses. Let's just start with the absolute biggest challenge they faced. I mean, with nobody to point a finger and say, I saw him do it, the prosecution's entire case had to be built on something completely different. And that something else was what we call circumstantial evidence. The entire case rested on it. So what is that exactly? Well, it's not direct proof. It's more like a collection of puzzle pieces. Individually, they don't mean much, but when you put them all together, they paint a very clear picture. Think of it like this. You see snowy footprints leading up to a door. You didn't actually see the person walk there, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming, right? But here's the thing. Building a murder case this way is walking a tightrope. If just one link in that logical chain snaps, the whole thing can just collapse.
Now you might be thinking, wow, that sounds kinda shaky for a murder conviction. And you wouldn't be alone. But here's what's so important. The final court of appeal looked at this and basically said the legal foundation was rock solid. They actually called the judge's instructions to that second jury impeccable. That's a powerful word. So this tells us something crucial. This conviction wasn't some fluke or a legal oopsie. No, it was the direct result of a very, very carefully constructed argument. All right, Section 2, the prosecution's logical chain. So what exactly was that argument? Well, the prosecution knew they couldn't just throw a bunch of random facts at the jury and hope something stuck. Instead, they built this incredibly precise three-step logical ladder, and it was designed to lead the jury to one place and one place only.
This was their game plan. It was so simple, yet so powerful. Step 1, they had to nail down the exact time and place the victim vanished. They called this the critical 5 minutes. Step 2, they had to use science, forensics, to prove the body and the box she was found in were physically inside that workshop. And finally, Step 3, isolate the suspect. They had to show that Oh Young Ping Kyung was the only person on Earth with the opportunity to commit the crime. You see how it works? It's like a chain. Each link has to connect perfectly to the next.
Okay, let's dive into that first link because this one was everything. Literally everything hinged on establishing a precise moment in time. Think about it. If the prosecution couldn't prove exactly when and where the victim, PNU Yiying, vanished, their whole case would just fall apart, right then and there.
So this is how they built their timeline, the so-called critical 5 minutes. It all comes down to the victim's friend, a girl named Chan Bun Bun. She testified that at exactly 6:30 p.m., she gets a call from Pian, who sounds really urgent. Pian says she's right there by the tram stop and needs a cassette tape back, like right now. And guess what's just yards away from that spot? The Americana shop, a place the two friends apparently used to meet. So Chan rushes over, but when she gets there, just 5 minutes later, at 6:35, Pian is gone, vanished into thin air. And just like that, the prosecution had its window. A critical 5-minute period where something terrible must have happened.
But hold on, because the defense came back with a really powerful counterargument. And what's brilliant is they used the prosecution's own forensic evidence to do it. First, they pointed to the stomach contents. The report suggested she died 3 to 4 hours after eating, which, if she had lunched at 1 p.m., would put her death much, much later in the evening. And second, the lividity of the body, that's how blood settles after death, suggested she was probably placed in that box closer to midnight, well after the accused had clocked out and gone home. So suddenly, that neat little critical 5 minutes theory looked like it was completely blown out of the water. So, what did the prosecution do? This is where it gets really clever. They basically turned the science against itself. On the stand, under intense questioning, they got the pathologist to admit that, you know what, trying to pinpoint the time of death based on stomach contents is very dangerous and unreliable. He had to concede that it depends on many, many factors, like stress, emotions, how fast someone digests food. It's just not an exact science. By poking holes in the certainty of the forensics, they managed to weaken the defense's timeline. They argued that, hey, it was still totally plausible that it was her 1 p.m. lunch in her stomach. And with that, the critical 5 minutes was back on the table. The jury bought it. All right, next up, the final crucial links. So with that critical 5 minutes timeline back in play, the prosecution moved on to their next big steps. Now they had to physically tie the victim to the workshop and then tie the workshop to their suspect.
And their whole scientific case was built on this one foundational idea in forensics: Locard's exchange principle. It sounds fancy, but the idea is super simple. Every contact leaves a trace. Basically, anytime two things touch, they swap microscopic bits of themselves. Hair, fibers, dust, you name it. So the prosecution's mission was clear: find all those tiny invisible traces that would connect the victim to the box, to the workshop, and finally, to the accused.
And wow, the stuff they found was just incredible. It was like a spider's web of microscopic connections. Check this out. They found tiny copper wire fragments on the body and in the box, and they were a perfect match for electrical wire in the workshop. They found a little paper slip on the victim's arm. It matched a paper roll inside the shop. They found a specific mix of paint and dust on the box and the body, identical to samples scraped from the workshop floor. But here's the real bombshell. They found two very unique green fibers. And where did they find them? On the body, in the box, on the workshop floor, and on Ah-Young's suit. A four-way match. Just unbelievable.
Okay, so the forensics pretty much screamed that the murder happened inside that workshop. The scene was established. Now, for the final critical link in the chain. They had to prove that Ah-Young was the only one who could have done it.
And this is how they put him in that room alone with her. First, the time card. His own company's time card proved he was the only employee there from 6 p.m. until after 10 p.m. That window perfectly covered their critical 5 minutes. But the real clincher, the thing that probably sealed his fate, was more fiber evidence. Remember his suit? Well, fibers that were an exact match to that suit were found dug in deep under the victim's fingernails. I mean, what else could that be but the silent proof of a desperate struggle for her life?
And then, the prosecution played its most controversial card. This is what's known as similar facts evidence. They brought witnesses to the stand who testified that, in the past, Ah-Young had done something really strange. He'd burned women's skirts with a cigarette on public ferries. Now, the prosecution had to be careful. They argued this wasn't about painting him as a bad guy. No, they said it was about establishing a signature. They drew this direct line from the very specific act of application of heat to the thigh region of a living girl to the incredibly bizarre act of application of heat to the pubic hair of the dead girl, a signature crime.
Of course, the defense screamed that this was totally unfair and prejudicial. And you can see why. But the Court of Appeal ultimately sided with the prosecution. And their reasoning is fascinating. They said this common feature, this specific act, was not only bizarre but also so very striking that it pointed directly to the killer. They basically ruled that it was such a unique behavioral signature that its value in proving identity was more important than the potential prejudice against him. So it was allowed.
Okay, let's wrap this up. The logic of conviction. So how did this massive mountain of tiny little pieces of indirect evidence add up to a guilty verdict? Not once, but twice.
14. That's the number. The total number of jurors across 2 different trials who sat and listened to this entire chain of logic. And every single one of them, all 14, were convinced, beyond a reasonable doubt. It just goes to show you how incredibly powerful and decisive the prosecution's argument became, especially in that retrial.
And really, that's the absolute key to understanding this case. This conviction wasn't about one single aha moment. There was no smoking gun. It was about the crushing cumulative weight of that entire logical chain. For the jury to convict, they had to buy into the whole package.
They had to accept a critical 5 minutes. They had to believe the forensic web connecting the body to the workshop. And they had to conclude that Oh Young was the only one with the opportunity and that bizarre behavioral signature. For those 14 jurors, every single one of those links was solid.
You know, this case is still a landmark in Hong Kong's legal history. It's really a masterclass in how to build a conviction purely from inference and logic. But it does leave us with a pretty deep and unsettling question, doesn't it? Does a flawless chain of circumstantial evidence, one that's so perfectly constructed that it convinces 14 different people, does that always lead to the absolute truth? That's a question I'll leave with you.